The letter arrived on a frozen January morning in 1878, and Katherine Dawson held it with trembling fingers as she stood on the platform of the Chicago train station, knowing that boarding this westbound train would change everything about her carefully ordered life. She had spent 23 years being the dutiful daughter, the perfect lady, the woman her mother had groomed her to be, but that letter from her aunt in Buffalo, Wyoming, had offered something she had never dared hope for: escape. Her Aunt Margaret needed help running her boarding house through the spring, just until she recovered from a broken leg. 3 months. Katherine had promised her bewildered parents she would return by May, when the weather turned warm and travel became easier. Her mother had protested. Her father had frowned, but in the end, they had let her go, perhaps sensing that their daughter needed this taste of freedom before settling into the marriage they had planned with Edmund Ashford, a banker's son with soft hands and softer ambitions. The train rattled westward for days, carrying her farther from everything familiar. Katherine watched the landscape transform through the window, from cities to farmland to endless prairie, and felt something inside her chest expand with each passing mile. She had read about the West in newspapers and dime novels, but nothing prepared her for the vastness of it, the way the sky seemed to go on forever, or how the mountains rose like ancient guardians in the distance. When she finally stepped off the train in Buffalo, Wyoming, the cold hit her like a physical thing. The wind swept down from the Bighorn Mountains with a bite that made Chicago winters seem gentle. She clutched her coat tighter and looked around the small platform, searching for her aunt's familiar face. Instead, she found herself looking into the bluest eyes she had ever seen. The man stood a few feet away, holding his hat in his hands despite the bitter wind. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. He wore a heavy coat over worn denim and leather, and his boots were scuffed and practical. Everything about him spoke of this place, of wide open spaces and hard work and a life lived under that endless sky. "Miss Dawson?" he asked, his voice low and rough, like gravel settling after rain. "Yes," she managed, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look in her fine traveling clothes and carefully pinned hair. "I am Isaac Logan. Your Aunt Margaret sent me to collect you. Her leg is healing well, but she could not make the trip in this cold." He reached for her trunk without waiting for permission, lifting it as though it weighed nothing. "My wagon is just over here." Katherine followed him across the platform, her boots slipping slightly on the icy boards. She wanted to tell him she could manage her smaller bag, but something about the way he moved with such easy confidence made her hold her tongue. This was not Chicago. The rules were different here. The wagon was sturdy and well-maintained, pulled by 2 strong horses that stamped and snorted in the cold. Isaac loaded her trunk into the back with practiced efficiency, then turned to help her up onto the seat. His hand was warm even through her glove, and strong. She settled onto the wooden bench and arranged her skirts while he walked around to climb up beside her. "Buffalo is about 20 minutes from here," he said as he gathered the reins. "Your aunt's boarding house is on the main street. She has a room ready for you." "Thank you for coming to meet me, Mr. Logan," Katherine said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the cold that was already seeping through her coat. "I hope it was not too much trouble." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "No trouble. I work at the ranch just outside town. Your aunt feeds me decent meals when I am in Buffalo, so I owe her a few favors." The wagon rolled forward, and Katherine gripped the edge of the seat as they left the train station behind. Buffalo was small, much smaller than she had expected, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered together as if seeking shelter from the immense landscape surrounding them. A general store, a saloon, a church with a modest steeple, a blacksmith shop with smoke rising from its chimney. People moved along the wooden sidewalks, bundled against the cold, and several turned to watch as Isaac drove the wagon down the main street. "That is your aunt's place," Isaac said, nodding toward a two-story building with a painted sign that read Dawson House in neat letters. "She runs a good establishment. Clean rooms, hot meals. Most of the men who stay there are ranch hands or travelers passing through." Katherine studied the building as they approached. It looked solid and well kept, with curtains in the windows and a covered porch that wrapped around the front. Smoke rose from two chimneys, promising warmth inside. She felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. This was real. She was really here, hundreds of miles from home, in a place where she knew no one except an aunt she had not seen since childhood. Isaac brought the wagon to a stop in front of the boarding house and set the brake. Before Katherine could gather her skirts to climb down, he had already rounded the wagon and was reaching up to help her. His hands circled her waist, and he lifted her down as easily as he had lifted her trunk. For just a moment, she was aware of his strength, of how solid he felt, and then her feet touched the ground and he stepped back, putting proper distance between them. The front door of the boarding house flew open, and Aunt Margaret appeared, leaning heavily on a crutch but beaming with delight. "Katherine, oh, my dear girl, you are finally here." Katherine hurried up the steps and into her aunt's embrace, careful of the injured leg. Margaret Dawson was her father's older sister, a widow who had moved west after her husband died 15 years ago. She had the same dark hair as Katherine's father, though now streaked with silver, and warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "Let me look at you," Margaret said, holding Katherine at arm's length. "Goodness, you have grown into such a beauty. Your mother must be beside herself trying to keep the young men at bay." Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "Mother has very definite ideas about suitable matches." "I am sure she does." Margaret's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Well, you are here now, and we shall have a lovely few months together. Come in, before you freeze solid." She looked past Katherine to where Isaac was lifting the trunk from the wagon. "Isaac, bring that trunk up to the room at the end of the hall upstairs, would you? Then come down for some coffee and pie. You must be half frozen." "Yes, madam," Isaac said, hoisting the trunk onto his shoulder. Inside, the boarding house was warm and welcoming. The front room served as a parlor, with comfortable furniture arranged around a pot-bellied stove that radiated heat. A dining room opened off to one side, and Katherine could see a long table set with places for perhaps a dozen people. The smell of something savory cooking drifted from what must be the kitchen, making her realize how hungry she was after days of train food. "I have 6 boarders at the moment," Margaret explained as she led Katherine toward the stairs, moving slowly with her crutch. "All good men, mostly ranch hands from the surrounding spreads. They know to mind their manners under my roof. Your room is private, with a good lock on the door, and you will take your meals with me in my quarters unless you prefer to serve in the dining room." Katherine followed her aunt up the stairs, one careful step at a time. Isaac moved past them with the trunk, taking the steps 2 at a time despite his burden. At the top of the stairs, he waited for Margaret to indicate which room, then disappeared inside to set down the trunk. The room was smaller than Katherine's bedroom in Chicago, but it had a charm all its own. A brass bed stood against one wall, covered with a colorful quilt. A small dresser, a chair by the window, a washstand with a white pitcher and bowl. The window looked out over the main street of Buffalo, and beyond that, the mountains rose in the distance, their peaks white with snow. "It is perfect," Katherine said softly and meant it. Isaac emerged from the room, settling his hat back on his head. "Trunk is by the bed, Miss Dawson." "Thank you so much, Mr. Logan." He nodded, his blue eyes meeting hers for just a moment. Something in his gaze made her breath catch, though she could not have said why. Then he turned to Margaret. "I should be getting back to the ranch, madam. Boss will be wondering where I got to." "Nonsense," Margaret said firmly. "You will come down and have coffee and pie, and I will hear no arguments. You have been out in this cold for over an hour doing me a favor. The least I can do is feed you properly." A smile tugged at the corner of Isaac's mouth, transforming his serious face into something warmer. "Yes, madam." "Never could say no to your pie." They all made their way back downstairs, and Margaret settled into a chair by the stove while Katherine helped her bring coffee and pie from the kitchen. The pie was apple, fragrant with cinnamon, and still warm from the oven. Katherine served Isaac a generous slice and poured his coffee, aware of his quiet presence in a way that unsettled her. "Isaac works as a foreman at the Double Bar Ranch," Margaret explained as she sipped her coffee. "He has been in Buffalo for about 4 years now. Is that right, Isaac?" "About that," he agreed, his attention on his pie. "Came up from Colorado looking for work. Mr. Henderson hired me on, and I have been at the Double Bar ever since." "Where are you from originally?" Katherine asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Isaac looked up at her, those blue eyes considering. "Montana Territory originally. My father had a small place up north, but he died when I was 16, sold the land and drifted south. Worked ranches in Montana, Colorado, and now here." There was a story behind those simple words. Katherine sensed years of hardship and struggle that he kept locked away behind that calm exterior. She wanted to ask more, to understand this quiet man who seemed so much a part of this wild landscape, but before she could find the right words, he was standing, setting his empty plate aside. "Thank you for the pie, madam. It was delicious as always." He nodded to Katherine. "Miss Dawson, I hope you settle in well. Buffalo is a good town, and your aunt will take fine care of you. Thank you again for meeting me at the station, Mr. Logan. Just Isaac is fine." He settled his hat more firmly on his head. "I am in town most Saturday evenings if you need anything heavy moved or any other help. Your aunt knows how to find me." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Katherine moved to the window and watched as he climbed back onto his wagon, gathered the reins, and drove away down the frozen street. Even after he disappeared from view, she found herself still looking out the window, her thoughts strangely unsettled. "He is a good man," Margaret said from her chair. "Quiet but steady, the kind you can rely on when things get difficult, and heaven knows things often get difficult out here." Katherine turned from the window, pushing thoughts of Isaac Logan aside. She was here to help her aunt, nothing more. In 3 months, she would return to Chicago, to her parents and her predetermined future. There was no point in letting her mind wander down impossible paths. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Katherine woke early each morning to help Margaret with breakfast for the boarders, learning to cook on the big iron stove and serve hearty meals of eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy. The men who lived at Dawson House were polite and respectful, touching their hats when they saw her, thanking her for the meals. Most were ranch hands in their 20s and 30s, weathered by sun and wind, smelling of horses and leather and the outdoors. She learned the rhythm of the boarding house, the way Margaret kept everything running smoothly despite her injured leg. Laundry on Monday, fresh linens on Tuesday, baking on Wednesday, the big shopping trip to the general store on Thursday. Margaret could not manage the heavy work, so Katherine took it on, surprised by how satisfying it felt to see clean sheets on the beds, to know she had made the bread that the boarders praised at dinner. Buffalo was small, but it had a life of its own. Katherine learned the names of the shopkeepers, the pattern of who came and went from the saloon, the schedule of the church services. The women of the town were friendly but cautious, clearly uncertain what to make of this city woman who had come to help Margaret Dawson. Katherine understood. She was an outsider here, and she would only be staying until spring. She reminded herself of that often. Until spring. Just until spring. Saturday evening came, and several of the boarders headed into town for drinks and cards at the saloon. Margaret was feeling tired, so Katherine encouraged her to rest while she cleaned up after dinner. She was in the kitchen, elbow deep in dishwater, when she heard the front door open and close. Wiping her hands on her apron, she emerged from the kitchen to find Isaac standing in the front room, brushing snow from his coat. It had started snowing an hour ago, fat flakes that drifted down from a gray sky, and his dark hair was dusted with white. "Evening, Miss Dawson," he said, pulling off his hat. "I was passing by and thought I would check if your aunt needed anything. Sometimes the walk to the general store is difficult for her in the snow." "That is very kind of you," Katherine said. "She is resting upstairs. Her leg has been bothering her today." Isaac frowned slightly, genuine concern crossing his face. "Has the doctor seen her recently?" He came by on Thursday. "He says she is healing well, but these things take time." "That is good." Isaac stood there, turning his hat in his hands, and Katherine realized he seemed uncertain, almost uncomfortable. It was strange to see this calm, confident man look anything less than completely self-assured. "Would you like some coffee?" she heard herself ask. "I just made a fresh pot, and there is pie left from dinner." Something that might have been relief flickered in his eyes. "That would be nice, thank you." Katherine led him to the kitchen, where it was warmer and more comfortable than the formal front room. She poured coffee and cut generous slices of the dried apple pie she had made that afternoon, pleased when she saw his expression of appreciation at the first bite. "This is excellent," he said. "Margaret has been teaching you." "I am learning. In Chicago, we had a cook who handled all the meals." "I never realized how satisfying it could be to make something with your own hands and see people enjoy it." Isaac wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, and Katherine noticed how large they were, scarred and calloused from hard work. "Chicago must seem very far away now." "It does," she admitted. "Sometimes I can barely remember what my life there was like. It feels like a dream, or like it was someone else's life entirely." "You miss it?" Katherine considered the question, surprised by how difficult it was to answer. "I miss my parents, but the life itself, I am not sure." Everything there felt so prescribed, so carefully planned. Every day I knew exactly what was expected of me, exactly how I should behave, exactly who I should be. Here it is all different. Different how? Freer, I suppose, more real. In Chicago, I felt like I was always playing a part, always performing for others. Here, I am just Katherine, washing dishes and baking bread and helping my aunt. No one cares if my dress is the latest fashion or if I make proper small talk at dinner parties. Isaac was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin warm. "I think I understand that. One of the reasons I like the West is that a man can be judged by what he does rather than where he came from or who his family was." "Is that what happened to you? Were you judged unfairly?" A shadow passed across his face. "My father was a good man, but he was not successful. We were poor and people made sure we knew it. After he died, I realized I could go somewhere no one knew me and start fresh, so I did." "Do you ever regret it, leaving Montana?" "No." The answer was immediate and definite. I made the right choice. This is where I belong. Katherine felt a strange pang at his certainty. She had never felt that kind of sureness about her place in the world. In Chicago, she had always felt slightly wrong, like a piece that did not quite fit the puzzle. Here in this rough frontier town, she felt more herself than she ever had, but she could not stay. She had promised her parents she would return in the spring. "You are frowning," Isaac observed. "I was just thinking about going back to Chicago." "You do not want to go back." It was not a question, and Katherine felt her defenses rise. "I made a promise to my parents. They are expecting me to return in May." "A lot can change between now and May." "What is that supposed to mean?" Isaac met her gaze steadily. "Just that sometimes we make promises before we know all the facts, before we know what we really want." "And you think I do not know what I want?" Katherine heard the edge in her own voice and could not quite contain it. "I think you are finding out." Isaac stood, setting his empty cup aside. "Thank you for the pie and coffee, Miss Dawson. Please tell your aunt I will check in again next week." He was gone before Katherine could formulate a response, leaving her alone in the kitchen with the sound of the wind outside and a confusion of feelings she did not want to examine too closely. Who was Isaac Logan to tell her what she did or did not know about herself? They barely knew each other. He had no right to make assumptions about her life or her choices, but as she finished the dishes and banked the fire for the night, his words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes we make promises before we know all the facts, before we know what we really want." What did she want? For 23 years, she had wanted what her parents wanted for her. A good marriage, a comfortable life, security and respectability. But lately, standing in her aunt's kitchen with her hands in dishwater and flour on her apron, she had started to wonder if there might be more to life than comfort and security. If there might be something worth wanting that had nothing to do with what was proper or expected. The next week brought a thaw, the temperature climbing just enough to turn the snow to slush and make the streets of Buffalo muddy and treacherous. Katherine learned to navigate the wooden sidewalks and to lift her skirts high enough to avoid the worst of the mud. She walked to the general store to pick up supplies and stopped to chat with the shopkeeper's wife, a friendly woman named Ruth, who seemed determined to make Katherine feel welcome. "We are having a social at the church next Saturday," Ruth said, as she wrapped Katherine's purchases in brown paper. "Nothing fancy, just music and dancing and food. You should come. It would be a good chance to meet more people." "I am not sure," Katherine hedged. "My aunt's leg is still healing and I do not like to leave her alone for long." "Bring her along," Ruth said with a wave of her hand. "Margaret Dawson has been to every social this town has had for the last 15 years. She is not about to miss one just because of a broken leg. We will make sure she has a comfortable chair and keep her supplied with pie and gossip. She will be perfectly happy." When Katherine mentioned the social to Margaret that evening, her aunt's face lit up. "Of course we should go. I have been climbing the walls being stuck in this house. A social would do us both good." So the next Saturday evening found Katherine helping her aunt into her best dress and pinning up her silver hair. They walked slowly to the church, Margaret leaning on Katherine's arm and moving carefully with her crutch. The evening was cold but clear, stars blazing in the black sky and lantern lights spilled from the church windows, welcoming and warm. Inside, the space had been cleared for dancing, chairs arranged along the walls for those who wanted to sit and visit. A small group of musicians tuned their instruments in the corner, a fiddle, a guitar, and a harmonica. Tables along one wall held food, pies and cakes and cookies, and someone had brought a large pot of punch. Katherine settled Margaret in a chair near the stove, made sure she had punch and friends to talk to, and then stood back, feeling suddenly uncertain. In Chicago, she had been to countless social events, balls and parties where she knew exactly how to behave and what to say. Here, she felt unmoored, unsure of the unwritten rules that governed this community. "You came." She turned to find Isaac standing behind her, and her heart did something complicated in her chest. He was cleaned up, wearing a white shirt instead of his usual work clothes, his dark hair still damp from washing. He looked different and yet completely the same, and Katherine found herself staring for just a moment too long. "My aunt wanted to come," she managed. "And Ruth from the general store insisted. Ruth is good at insisting." A smile tugged at his mouth. "Would you like to dance?" The musicians had started playing, a lively tune that had several couples already whirling around the floor. Katherine hesitated, aware of the many eyes watching them, but something about Isaac's steady gaze made her bold. "Yes," she said, "I would." His hand was warm and strong as he led her onto the floor, and when he placed his other hand at her waist, Katherine felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the music or the dance. They moved together, and she was surprised by how well he danced, how confidently he guided her through the steps. "You are a good dancer," she said, having to speak loudly to be heard over the music. "My mother insisted I learn," he said. "She said that a gentleman should know how to dance properly, even if we did not have money for anything else." Katherine wondered about his mother, about the family he had lost, but before she could ask, the song ended and another began, slower this time. Isaac kept her in his arms and they swayed together, closer now. Katherine was aware of every point of contact between them, his hand on her waist, her hand in his, the way they moved as one to the music. "Katherine," he said, and hearing her name in his rough voice sent a shiver down her spine. "I have been thinking about what I said last week, about you not knowing what you want. I was out of line. Your life is your own business and I had no right to comment on it." She looked up at him, surprised. "I appreciate the apology, but you are not entirely wrong. I have been thinking about what I want and I am not sure I have a good answer yet. You have time to figure it out." "Do I? I am supposed to leave in 3 months." His arms tightened around her just slightly. "A lot can happen in 3 months." They danced through 2 more songs, and Katherine felt something shifting between them, some wall coming down. When the music finally stopped for a break, Isaac released her reluctantly, and she felt the loss of his warmth like a physical thing. "Thank you for the dances," he said formally, but his eyes were warm. "Thank you for asking." Katherine returned to her aunt's side, aware that several of the women were watching her with interest. Margaret patted her hand, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Isaac Logan is a fine dancer," her aunt observed. "Yes, he is, and a fine man if you are interested in my opinion." Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "Aunt Margaret, I am just saying, he has been alone since he came to Buffalo. Never shown interest in any of the young women in town, though plenty have set their caps at him. But the way he looks at you, well, that is something different." "I am only here until spring," Katherine said, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Plans change, my dear. Life has a way of surprising us." The rest of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. Katherine danced with several other men, ranch hands and shopkeepers and the young banker who had just moved to town, but none of them made her feel the way Isaac had. None of them made her heart race or her skin warm with just a look. When she glanced across the room and found Isaac watching her, their eyes met and held, and Katherine felt something lock into place inside her chest, something she was not ready to name. The weeks that followed were the happiest Katherine could remember. She fell into the rhythm of life at the boarding house, learning from her aunt and finding satisfaction in work that was honest and real. She baked bread and scrubbed floors and changed linens, and at night, she fell into bed exhausted but content in a way she had never been in Chicago. And she saw Isaac. He came by the boarding house often, always with some excuse. He needed to check if Margaret needed supplies brought from the store. He was delivering a message from one of the ranch hands who boarded there. He was passing by and thought he would see if anything needed fixing. Margaret saw through his excuses and smiled her knowing smile, but she never commented, just made sure there was always fresh coffee and pie when Isaac appeared. Katherine and Isaac talked for hours, sitting in the warm kitchen while the snow fell outside. He told her about growing up in Montana, about his father teaching him to rope and ride, about the grief of losing both parents by the time he was 17. She told him about Chicago, about the suffocating expectations and the feeling that she was living someone else's life. They talked about everything and nothing, and with each conversation, Katherine felt herself drawn deeper into something she could not control. In early March, the weather turned warmer. The snow began to melt in earnest, creating rushing streams in every gully and turning the streets of Buffalo into rivers of mud. Margaret's leg had healed well, and she was moving around much more easily now, barely needing her crutch. Katherine knew she should be thinking about her return to Chicago, about writing to her parents to finalize her travel plans, but she kept putting it off, finding excuses to delay. One afternoon, Isaac appeared at the boarding house driving a wagon loaded with supplies. "I am heading out to one of the line shacks to check on the cattle," he explained. "Thought you might like to come along, see more of the country. Your aunt says she can spare you for a few hours." Katherine glanced at Margaret, who was sitting by the window mending socks. Her aunt gave her an encouraging nod. "Go on, dear. You have been working hard. You deserve an afternoon out." So Katherine grabbed her shawl and let Isaac help her up onto the wagon seat. They drove out of town, following a rough track that led up into the foothills. The landscape was beautiful in a raw, harsh way, all rocks and scrubby vegetation and vast sky. Hawks circled overhead, and in the distance, Katherine could see cattle grazing. "It is so big," she said softly. "Sometimes I forget how big it all is." "That is what I love about it," Isaac said. "All this space. A man can breathe out here." They reached the line shack, a small rough cabin used by ranch hands during roundup. Isaac checked on the supplies stored there and noted what needed to be restocked. Katherine wandered outside, breathing in the cold air and watching the clouds move across the sky. She could hear water rushing somewhere nearby, snowmelt running down from the mountains. Isaac found her standing at the edge of a small cliff, looking out over the valley below. Buffalo was just visible in the distance, a small cluster of buildings that looked impossibly tiny against the immensity of the land. "Katherine," he said, and something in his voice made her turn to face him. He was standing closer than she expected, close enough that she could see the exact blue of his eyes, the fine lines at the corners from squinting into the sun. Close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I know you are supposed to leave soon," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I know you made promises to your parents and you have a life waiting for you in Chicago, but I need to say this before you go. I need you to know." "Know what?" Katherine whispered, her heart thundering in her chest. "That I love you. I have loved you since that first day at the train station when you looked at me with those eyes like you were seeing me, really seeing me in a way no one else ever has. I know I have no right to say this. I am just a ranch foreman with nothing to offer you except hard work and an uncertain future. But I love you, Katherine Dawson, and I think maybe you love me too." Katherine stared at him, the words echoing in her ears. He loved her. This strong, steady man loved her. And the truth was, she loved him too. She had been fighting it for weeks, telling herself it was impossible, that she could not let herself feel this way, but standing here with the wind in her hair and Isaac looking at her like she was his whole world, all her defenses crumbled. "I do," she said, and her voice shook with the enormity of the admission. "I love you too." Isaac closed the distance between them in one step, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Then stay. Do not go back to Chicago. Stay here with me. Marry me." "Isaac, I cannot just abandon my family. They are expecting me to come home. There is a man they want me to marry, a whole life they have planned. But is it the life you want?" His thumbs stroked along her cheekbones, gentle despite the roughness of his hands. "You said yourself that you felt like you were playing a part in Chicago. Here you are free to be yourself. Here you are home." Tears stung Catherine's eyes because he was right. Somewhere between the train station and this moment, Buffalo had become home. Not just the town, but this feeling, this sense of rightness that she found in Isaac's arms. "My parents will never forgive me," she whispered. "Maybe not at first, but you are their daughter. Eventually they will want you to be happy, even if your happiness looks different from what they planned. They will think I have lost my mind, running off with a cowboy I barely know. Then write to them. Tell them the truth. Tell them that you have found something real here, something worth staying for." His voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. "Tell them that you love me and I love you, and that is enough." Katherine looked into his eyes and saw her future there. Not a future of drawing rooms and calling cards and polite conversation, but a future of sunrises over mountains and hard work and laughter in a warm kitchen. A future of love, the kind that was real and raw and utterly honest. "Yes," she said, and felt as though a weight had lifted from her chest. "Yes, I will stay. I will marry you." Isaac kissed her then, his lips warm and sure against hers, and Katherine wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. The wind blew around them, carrying the scent of sage and melting snow, and in the distance, a hawk cried out, its call echoing across the valley. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "We should get back to town before your aunt sends out a search party." Katherine laughed, giddy with joy and terror and pure relief. "She probably knew this would happen. She has been matchmaking since I arrived. Remind me to thank her." They drove back to Buffalo as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Katherine sat close to Isaac on the wagon seat, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. She felt completely at peace, even knowing the difficult conversations that lay ahead. Margaret was waiting in the front room when they returned, and one look at their faces told her everything she needed to know. "Well," she said with satisfaction, "it is about time." Isaac grinned. "You are not surprised." "Surprised? I have been waiting for you two to realize what was obvious to everyone else for weeks." Margaret pulled Katherine into a hug. "I am so happy for you, dear. Isaac is a good man and he will take care of you." "I know," Katherine said, hugging her aunt back. "But I need to write to my parents. They need to hear this from me. Of course. They will be upset at first, but they love you. They will come around." Margaret stepped back, her eyes bright with tears. "Your mother and I disagreed about many things over the years, but we both want you to be happy. Write to her, explain everything. Give her time." That night, Katherine sat at the small desk in her room and wrote the hardest letter of her life. She told her parents about Buffalo, about the work she had been doing at the boarding house, about how she had found a sense of purpose and belonging she had never felt in Chicago. She told them about Isaac, about his kindness and strength and integrity. And she told them that she was staying, that she was going to marry him, that she hoped they could understand and forgive her for breaking her promise. The letter took hours to write, draft after draft, until she finally found the words that felt true and honest. She sealed it and gave it to Isaac the next day to post. Then there was nothing to do but wait for a response and plan her new life. Isaac proposed properly the following Saturday, going down on one knee in Margaret's front parlor with a simple gold band he had bought from the jeweler in town. Katherine said yes again, her eyes swimming with happy tears, and Margaret popped open a bottle of champagne she had been saving for a special occasion. They set the wedding for early May, wanting to give Katherine's parents time to respond and perhaps even come if they could arrange travel. In the meantime, Katherine threw herself into preparations. She had her aunt's house to think of, and she needed to find a replacement to help Margaret once she married and moved to the small foreman's house at the Double Bar Ranch where Isaac lived. Word spread through Buffalo that the city woman was marrying Isaac Logan, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. The women of the town welcomed Katherine with open arms, bringing her bits of lace and fabric for her dress, sharing recipes and advice about running a ranch household. Ruth from the general store organized a quilting party, and Katherine sat surrounded by women she barely knew a few months ago, now her friends, sewing squares for a wedding quilt and laughing at stories about married life. Isaac came by every day, whenever his work at the ranch allowed. They took long walks around Buffalo, talking about their future, about the children they hoped to have, about the life they would build together. He showed her the foreman's house where they would live, a small two-room cabin that needed work but had good bones and a view of the mountains that took Katherine's breath away. "We will add on as our family grows," Isaac said, standing in the empty main room with Katherine's hand in his. "A bedroom or two, maybe a bigger kitchen, whatever you need." "It is perfect," Katherine said, and meant it. She could see their future in this little house, could imagine cooking at the small stove and hanging curtains in the windows and sitting on the porch in the evening watching the sun set. In late April, a letter arrived from Chicago. Katherine's hands shook as she opened it, fearing anger and rejection. But her mother's words, though strained, held an unexpected understanding. She wrote that she was hurt and disappointed, that this was not the life she had wanted for her daughter. But she also wrote that a mother's job was to raise her children to make their own choices, even when those choices broke her heart. She would not be able to attend the wedding. The journey was too far and too difficult, but she sent her blessing and a promise to visit when travel became easier. Katherine wept as she read the letter, relief and grief tangling together. She had chosen her own path, and it had cost her, but her mother loved her enough to let her go. That was more than she had dared hope for. The wedding took place on a bright May morning, the same month Katherine had originally planned to return to Chicago. Instead, she stood in Buffalo's small church, wearing a dress she had sewn herself with help from the women of the town, simple white cotton trimmed with lace. Aunt Margaret stood beside her, beaming with pride. The church was packed with people, ranch hands and shopkeepers and families from the surrounding spreads, all there to witness Isaac Logan and Katherine Dawson pledge their lives to each other. Isaac stood at the altar in a new white shirt and dark trousers, his hair neatly combed but already showing signs of rebellion. When Katherine walked down the aisle on her aunt's arm, his face transformed with such open joy that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The ceremony was short and simple, the words traditional but infused with meaning that took Katherine's breath away. When Isaac slipped the gold ring onto her finger and promised to love and cherish her for all his days, she believed him with her whole heart. When she made the same promises to him, she felt the truth of them settle into her bones. They kissed to applause and cheers, and then they were walking back down the aisle together, husband and wife, ready to begin their new life. The reception was held at the boarding house, tables set up outside in the spring sunshine. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the street. Katherine danced with Isaac, then with the ranch hands who worked with him, then with the elderly doctor who had set Margaret's leg, and now danced with surprising grace. She ate cake and accepted congratulations, and felt wrapped in the warmth of this community that had welcomed her. As the sun began to set, Isaac pulled her aside. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Logan, Mrs. Logan." Katherine smiled at the sound of her new name. "Yes, I am ready." They said their goodbyes and walked hand in hand through the streets of Buffalo toward the edge of town where Isaac had a wagon waiting. Other ranch hands would bring her things out to the double bar later, but for tonight, it was just the two of them and the setting sun and the promise of their first night as husband and wife. The foreman's house was dark when they arrived, but Isaac had prepared for their return. He lit lanterns while Katherine looked around at what would now be her home. Somehow, while she had been busy with wedding preparations, he had transformed the rough cabin. Curtains hung in the windows, cheerful yellow fabric that glowed in the lamplight. A new rag rug covered the floor. The bed was made with fresh linens and the quilt the women had sewn for them. On the small table sat a jar of wildflowers, purple and white blooms that he must have picked himself. "Isaac," Katherine breathed, turning to look at him. "You did all this," he shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "I wanted you to feel welcome, wanted it to feel like home." Katherine crossed the room and took his face in her hands. "Anywhere with you would feel like home." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, his hands coming to rest at her waist. Katherine kissed him back, all the love and desire and joy she felt pouring into that kiss. When he swept her into his arms and carried her to the bed, she went willingly, eagerly, ready to begin this new chapter of their life together. Their first night as husband and wife was tender and passionate, full of whispered promises and gentle explorations, and the profound intimacy of two people who had chosen each other completely. Afterward, Katherine lay in Isaac's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, his hand stroking through her hair. "I have never been happier," she said truthfully. "I cannot imagine my life without you now. It is strange to think that 6 months ago I did not know you existed. You said you would only stay until spring, and you made me want to stay forever." Isaac tightened his arms around her. "Forever sounds about right." The months that followed were a period of adjustment and joy. Katherine learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and hard work and the satisfaction of a job well done. She learned to cook on a temperamental stove and to make do with what they had. Money was tight, Isaac's salary as a foreman modest, but Katherine found she did not mind. She had grown up with every material comfort, and none of it had made her as happy as sitting on the porch of their little house in the evening, watching Isaac ride in from a day working cattle. She became friends with the other ranch wives, women who taught her how to preserve food and mend clothes and keep a house running in this harsh land. She rode into Buffalo once a week to visit Aunt Margaret and help at the boarding house, though her aunt had found a capable young woman to do most of the heavy work now. In the fall, Katherine realized she was pregnant. She told Isaac one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and orange. He pulled her into his arms, his face buried in her hair, and she felt the dampness of tears on his cheeks. "We are going to have a baby," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Katherine, we are going to be parents. Are you happy?" He pulled back to look at her, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "Happy does not begin to cover it. I love you so much," both of you. The pregnancy was difficult at times, the morning sickness lasting well into the afternoon, and the winter was hard. But Katherine never regretted her choice. Even on the coldest days, when the wind howled around their little house and ice formed on the inside of the windows, she was exactly where she wanted to be, in early spring, as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared on the prairie. Katherine went into labor. Isaac rode for the doctor while Aunt Margaret stayed with her, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. The labor was long and painful, but when Katherine finally heard her baby's first cry, all the pain was forgotten. "It is a boy," the doctor announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant in Katherine's arms. "Healthy and loud. Congratulations, Mrs. Logan." Katherine looked down at her son, at his tiny perfect fingers and the shock of dark hair, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. When Isaac burst through the door, wild-eyed with worry, she smiled at him through her tears. "Come meet your son," she said. Isaac approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. He sat down beside Katherine and looked at the baby cradled in her arms, and his expression of wonder and love was something Katherine knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "He is perfect," Isaac whispered, reaching out to stroke one tiny hand with his finger. The baby's hand closed around Isaac's finger, gripping tight, and Isaac's face crumpled. "He is perfect, and he is ours." They named him James, after Isaac's father, with the middle name William, after Katherine's father. When Katherine wrote to her parents with the news, her mother's return letter was warm and full of grandmotherly love, with a promise to visit when James was a bit older. The rift between them had not healed completely, but it was mending, slowly but surely. James was a happy baby, quick to smile and curious about everything. Katherine threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she had brought to learning ranch life, and Isaac was a devoted father, coming home each evening eager to hold his son and help with his care. 2 years later, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, a tiny girl with Katherine's dark hair and Isaac's blue eyes. She was followed 2 years after that by another son, Thomas, who had his father's serious temperament and his mother's stubbornness. The little foreman's house expanded, just as Isaac had promised. He added 2 bedrooms and a larger kitchen, building in the evenings after work and on Sundays after church. Other ranch hands helped, and slowly the house grew to accommodate their growing family. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and hard winters, times when money was scarce and worry kept Katherine up at night. But through it all, she and Isaac faced everything together. Their love, which had started as a spark that cold January day at the train station, had grown into something deep and unshakable. On their 10th anniversary, Isaac surprised Katherine with a trip to Buffalo for dinner at the hotel restaurant, a rare luxury. Aunt Margaret watched the children, shooing them out the door with instructions to enjoy themselves. As they sat across from each other in the candlelight, Katherine reached across the table to take Isaac's hand. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "That I stayed? That you asked me to give up my old life?" Isaac's hand tightened on hers. "Never, not for one single moment." "You are my heart, Katherine. You and our children, you are everything. Do you regret staying?" Katherine thought about the woman she had been, stepping off that train in the freezing cold, uncertain and afraid but desperately hoping for something different. She thought about the life she could have had in Chicago, safe and comfortable and utterly empty. And she thought about the life she had chosen instead, full of hard work and worry and love so deep it sometimes took her breath away. "No," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I have never regretted it, not even once. Good." Isaac smiled at her, that slow smile that still made her heart race even after 10 years. "Because I plan to keep you forever." "Forever," Katherine agreed. "That sounds perfect." The years continued to pass, marked by the small and large moments that make up a life. James grew tall and strong, taking after his father, and at 18 he went to work at the Double Bar Ranch alongside Isaac. Clara was quieter, a reader and a dreamer, who eventually became a teacher at Buffalo's small school. Thomas, the baby, surprised everyone by showing a talent for drawing and an interest in architecture, eventually leaving Wyoming to study in Denver but always coming home for Christmas. Isaac rose through the ranks at the Double Bar, eventually becoming the ranch manager when the old manager retired. The salary increase allowed them to add even more to their house and to save money for their children's futures. Katherine continued to help at Aunt Margaret's boarding house until her aunt passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, leaving the boarding house to Katherine in her will. Katherine and Isaac discussed what to do with the property and eventually decided to sell it to the capable young woman who had been running it for years. With the proceeds, they were able to buy a small piece of land adjacent to the Double Bar and build a modest house of their own, no longer tied to Isaac's position as manager. On the day they moved into their new house, Katherine stood on the front porch and looked out at the mountains, the same view that had captivated her that first winter in Buffalo. She was 50 years old now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her hands' work roughened and capable. She bore little resemblance to the uncertain young woman who had stepped off the train so many years ago. Isaac came to stand beside her, his own hair more gray than dark now, lines carved deep around his eyes from a lifetime of squinting at the sun. He wrapped an arm around her waist and pulled her close. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how much has changed," Katherine said. "About the life I thought I would have and the life I actually got. Any regrets?" She turned to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "Not a single one. You made me want to stay forever, Isaac Logan, and forever with you has been better than I ever could have imagined." He kissed her then, sweet and tender, a kiss that spoke of decades of love and partnership and shared joy. When they finally pulled apart, they stood together on their porch and watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, surrounded by the life they had built together. Their children visited often, bringing grandchildren who filled the house with laughter and chaos. James married a rancher's daughter and gave them 3 grandchildren. Clara married the doctor's son and had twin girls. Thomas brought home a woman from Denver, an artist like himself, and they eventually settled in Buffalo, opening a small gallery that attracted visitors from as far away as Cheyenne. As Katherine and Isaac grew older, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. They took daily walks around their property, weather permitting, and sat together on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the light fade from the sky. They attended church on Sundays and went to town for the monthly socials, dancing together as they had at that first social so many decades ago. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration at the church, inviting everyone they knew. The church was packed, just as it had been on their wedding day, but now it was full of people whose lives Katherine and Isaac had touched over 5 decades. There were ranch hands Isaac had trained and mentored, students Clara had taught, business owners Thomas had worked with, and families who had been neighbors and friends through good times and bad. Isaac stood to speak, his voice still strong despite his 75 years. 50 years ago, I went to the train station to pick up a city woman who was coming to help her aunt. I expected to drive her to the boarding house, have some coffee and pie, and go back to my life. Instead, I met the woman who would become my whole life. Katherine, you took a chance on a cowboy who had nothing to offer you except love and hard work. You gave up comfort and security for a life that was uncertain and difficult. And in return, I have tried every single day to make sure you never regretted that choice. I love you more today than I did 50 years ago, and I will love you until my last breath. There was not a dry eye in the church, and Katherine was weeping openly as Isaac helped her to her feet. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of her children and grandchildren, at the community that had become her family, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. I came to Buffalo thinking I would only stay until spring, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I had a whole life planned out, a life that looked safe and predictable. But Isaac made me want to stay forever, and staying was the best decision I ever made. This life, this beautiful, messy, wonderful life, has been everything I did not know I needed. Thank you all for being part of it. The celebration lasted long into the evening, with food and dancing and speeches from people whose lives had been touched by Katherine and Isaac's love story. When they finally returned home, exhausted but happy, they sat together on their porch under the stars. 50 years, Katherine said softly. It has gone so fast. And we still have more time, Isaac said, bringing her hand to his lips. I am not ready to be done with you yet. Good, because I am not ready to be done with you either. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the wind in the grass, and the distant call of an owl. Katherine thought about all the years behind them and whatever years remained ahead, and felt completely at peace. Isaac died in his sleep 5 years later at the age of 80. Katherine woke one morning to find him still beside her, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. The grief was profound, a physical pain that left her breathless, but there was also gratitude. They had been given 55 years together, far more than many couples got, and every one of those years had been precious. The funeral was large, people coming from all over the region to pay their respects to a man who had been respected and loved by all who knew him. Katherine stood at the graveside surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and as they lowered Isaac's coffin into the ground, she felt a strange sense of rightness. He was at peace, and he had lived a full life, a good life. In the months that followed, Katherine adjusted to life alone. Her children wanted her to move in with one of them, but she insisted on staying in the house she and Isaac had built. She was 80 years old and still capable of taking care of herself. She kept busy, tending her garden and visiting with friends and spending time with her growing number of great-grandchildren. 2 years after Isaac died, Katherine caught a cold that turned into pneumonia. She knew, as she felt her strength fading, that her time was coming to an end. She was not afraid. She had lived 82 full years, had loved deeply and been loved in return, had raised children and seen them raise children of their own. On her last day, surrounded by her family, Katherine looked around at all the faces she loved and felt overwhelming peace. James held one of her hands, Clara the other, and Thomas stood at the foot of her bed. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the room, and she could see traces of herself and Isaac in all of them, their legacy living on. "Tell me," she said to James, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me about the ranch." So James told her about the double bar, about the cattle and the horses and the spring roundup that was coming soon. He told her about the new calves and the fence that needed mending and the young man he was training, just as Isaac had once trained him. Katherine listened, her eyes closing, and she could almost see it, the wide open prairie and the mountains rising in the distance and Isaac riding toward her with that slow smile on his face. "He is waiting for me," she murmured. Clara leaned close. "Who is, Mama?" "Your father. He is waiting." Catherine's breathing slowed, grew shallow. I said I would only stay until spring, but he made me want to stay forever, and forever was not nearly long enough. Those were her last words. Katherine Dawson Logan died peacefully, surrounded by love, on a warm spring afternoon in 1935. She was buried next to Isaac in the Buffalo Cemetery, under a shared headstone that bore both their names and a simple inscription. Forever was not nearly long enough. The house they had built together was eventually inherited by Thomas and his wife, who lovingly maintained it and raised their own children there. The story of Katherine and Isaac became part of Buffalo's history, the tale of a city woman who came for 3 months and stayed for a lifetime, and the cowboy who loved her enough to give her a reason to stay. On quiet evenings when the wind blows down from the mountains and the sky turns gold with sunset, locals sometimes say you can see 2 figures walking hand in hand across the prairie, a tall man and a woman in a long skirt, together in death as they were in life. Whether it is true or just a romantic story, no one can say for certain. But everyone agrees that if any love was strong enough to transcend death, it was the love between Katherine Dawson and Isaac Logan, the woman who stayed and the cowboy who made her want to stay forever.